Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very happy to be here again for lesson number 2 in the class titled Journey of the Soul. I'm sure many of you have questions on last week's class. Some of you have emailed or texted me your questions. Feel free to do that again this week. If you have anything that is bothering you or any questions you have on the class, please feel free to email me or ask in the chat box. I will try to get to it as best as possible. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? Last week we spoke about life and death. This week we're going to get a little bit into some of the technicalities of the final moments of a person's life. And we will also get into some of the technicalities of the what happens when after we die. But like last week, the focus is not on the end, but the focus we're going to try is to understand our continuation of life and how we progress through life. How does that sound? Okay. All right, so welcome to lesson 2. You should have it open in front of you. Taking Leave is the title of today's lesson. In the student page 41, you have the introduction. Is death painful for souls? Is my presence felt when I visit a grave? And what is Judaism's pre-burial and burial rituals accompany the soul's gradual transition from a limited physical life to a completely spiritual one? We will discuss those rituals and how, once freed, the soul's connection to the living continues in a new and powerful way. And we'll conclude today's lesson with a letter that was written to my great aunt after my great grandfather was murdered in Boston, Massachusetts on New Year's Eve. And a letter that the Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote to his daughter, my great aunt, Chana Sharfstein. So let's jump right into today's lesson on page 42. A little warning though, as we progress in today's lesson, we're going to find many contradictions, even in the things that I say. So for example, we're going to talk about the infinity or the continuity of the soul. And when we talk about that, it's very easy for us to come to the conclusion, based on what we're going to learn, that the body seems to play an insignificant or a very minor role. But at the same time, I'm going to say that the body, our life here on earth, in other words, plays a major role in our existence. And if that's what we're going to talk about, then what is the role of the soul? So we're kind of going to go back and forth. So bear with me, and hopefully we'll answer all the questions as we come to the class conclusion. So today we're going to discuss what happens during the interval between the moment a person passes away and interment. What happens from the second the person passes till he or she is buried. What is the soul's departure from the body, and what is its signal? The onset of the new phase in its journey. It is no longer tethered or limited or constrained by the body. Now the soul can soar on high and just be itself, do whatever the soul wants to do, which may come to help us understand that the body is simply an obstacle to what the soul's infinite desire of what it wants to do. But it's not exactly like that. Today's lesson has 4 parts. I'm going to pull up the slideshow. Second here. There we go. Okay. So Journey of the Soul, Lesson 2. Today we're going to talk about the moments of passing, the process of the soul's departure, the cure of body and interment, how we have to take care of the body, and finally we will talk about, hold on one second. Okay. The grave and the visitation. Right? Don't be scared about these subjects. This is all part of our journey. And as the famous philosopher said, there's two things that are certainly will happen. That is taxes and death. And we're going to learn today about the beauty of the journey and the next steps in life. But first, before we begin, I have to talk about two levels of the soul. The physical nefesh and the ruach, which is also be found in your books on page 42. So if you see on page 42, we're going to talk a little bit about these two souls. Now, last week, someone asked a question in the chat about the 5 levels of the soul, and I kind of said we'll talk about it another time. So right now we're going to address 2 levels of the soul. Number 1, according to the Kabbalists, they talk about the human being having 5 levels of consciousness, or in spiritual terms, 5 levels of the soul. And they are, in short, nefesh, which means soul, ruach, which means spirit, neshama, which means breath, chaya, which means life, and yechida, which means oneness. Today we're going to talk about 2, like I mentioned, we're going to talk about nefesh and ruach, the 2 lower levels of the soul. Nefesh means soul, and ruach is also referring to the soul, but the literal translation of ruach means spirit. Okay? There are 5 functions of the soul, or 5 conscious levels of the soul. Each level goes higher and higher, and each level assists us human beings in connecting to God on a deeper, more wholesome level. Think about when you're dating or when you just got married. You certainly tell your spouse, I love you. And when you're married 10 years, you say again, I love you. Would anybody suspect, by the way, that's the craziest term, I love you, is really the most oxymoronic statement to tell someone that you really love, because you're saying I before you. So if you really love the person, it should be you love I, or whatever. I don't know how to say it, but I love you certainly doesn't make sense. But anyway, that's a side note. But the love that a person has when they're married 10 years, you cannot compare it to the love that the person had when they're married 1 year, right? Yeah, you're saying the same thing, I love you. But you certainly mean a much deeper perspective of love, a much deeper connection that we have now after these 10 years, or after 20 years, 30 years, and so on and so forth. And so the same thing is also with us and our soul. We have one level of our soul, we'll call it level 1, and then we go deeper to level 2, then we go even deeper, level 3, level 4, and ultimately we reach the 5th level of the soul, which is the highest level. So tonight we're going to talk about, for a brief moment, the first 2 levels of the soul. And I'm talking about these 2 levels because in a way it's a little introduction to the first reading that we're going to talk about, which is a letter that the Alter Rebbe wrote to the students of his mentor, his teacher and colleague, who lived in Sfat, Israel. After he passed away, the Alter Rebbe sent this letter to his friends, or his colleagues' students. And the level of nefesh, if you look inside again in the textbook, page 42. If you don't have it, please let me know, but it should be also in the chat box in case you didn't see it yet. Nefesh enables physical, biological life. The nefesh gets buried in the grave. Okay? The ruach enables emotions and the ruach continues to live in the Garden of Eden in paradise. So we have right now two levels. One, the lowest level of the soul is connected to the body. It's one with the body, and after 120 years, the person gets buried. Then we have another level of the soul, which continues to live on even after the body is buried. By the way, the other three levels above that also continue to live on. So it's only one part of us that actually gets buried, which is, as we will talk about, why it's important for burial, because the soul continues to remain connected to the body in the grave. So now that we have a little overview of this idea of two souls, we will better understand the text 1a on page 43. Catherine, would you like to read, please? Just unmute yourself and you can read.
Sure.
Go ahead.
As it is known, the life of the tzaddik, the righteous person, is not physical but spiritual. It consists of faith, reverence, and love for God. During the tzaddik's lifetime on earth, these three attributes that belong to the soul dimension of ruach are constrained within their container and garb, namely the nefesh, that is bound to the corporeal body. This imposes the restraints of physical space upon these attributes. As a result, all the tzaddik's disciples receive but a glow of these ruach attributes, a mere ray that is emitted beyond the container by means of the tzaddik's holy words and thoughts. The inability to receive directly from ruach is a revelatory handicap, and therefore our sages stated that it takes 40 years for students to fully plumb the depths of their master's teachings. By contrast, after the tzaddik's passing, the nefesh separates from the ruach and remains in the grave, while the ruach and its three attributes raise to Gan Eden. Consequently, whoever is close to the tzaddik can receive directly from his ruach in Gan Eden, because the ruach is no longer restrained in a container or confined to a physical space. There is now a straightforward path for the tzaddik's disciples to connect with the essence of their master's ruach, the faith, awe, and the love with which the tzaddik served God, and not merely these attributes, outer glow that escape beyond their container. The disciples connect and receive, oh, I just lost it, and receive,
Commensurate.
oh yeah, commensurate to the degree of their loving connection and closeness to the tzaddik during his lifetime and after his death. For the transmission of all things spiritual is always by means of great love.
So the Alter Rebbe is saying essentially is that during a tzaddik's, a righteous person's lifetime, and on some degree it's referring to all of us because we all have a righteous streak within us as well. And during our lifetime, our soul, our lower level of soul, nefesh, is constrained by the body. But after a person passes away, we then are untethered to the body, and the soul can continue to impact us on a much greater degree. In fact, during our lifetime, the Alter Rebbe is saying, the tzaddik is in a body. So you can essentially only connect to the righteous person, to your teacher, as the person is standing within the body, which is very limited. But after the person passes away, the expression, you can connect to the person on a much deeper level. You're not limited to the first state. You can connect to the essence of the tzaddik. Why? Because the ruach, the higher level of soul, is unleashed. And this is what's gained during the passing of the righteous individual. So these two stages help us understand in a clearer picture that there's distinct phases within the person's existence. The first stage is while we're living our life to its fullest down here with the soul, of course. And after we die, we have the potential to live on a much deeper, much greater level. We're going to show a little video that will help us hopefully understand it a little bit more. Let me share the screen here. Get thumbs up if you can hear.
Welcome to our meditation reflection for lesson 2 of Journey of the Soul. We're going to try to visualize and relate to the idea of continuing connection between those who are still inhabiting this world and their loved ones who have moved on. How can we visualize this connection? So I want to share with you a metaphor that was given by the Lubavitcher Rebbe to a grieving family when they lost their dear mother. The Rebbe told the family, you should know that your loved one, when they pass away, hasn't gone to some faraway place. Really, what is the situation? It's as if the whole family is together on the first floor of the house, and this loved one is in the same house with you on the second floor. So we're going to try to visualize. Again, if it helps you to close your eyes, you can close your eyes. If you want to leave your eyes open, leave your eyes open. But start to visualize in your mind's eye a loved one who's passed on. Try to imagine what it was like when you would gather and that person was physically with you. Try to remember the sights, the sounds, the whole setting. And now, imagine that exact same gathering, same setting, and that loved one who's passed on is still there with one difference. They're on the second floor. Take a moment to imagine the feeling. It's hard to describe it, but if we envision it, we may be able to feel it. What does it feel like? The knowledge that this loved one you may not be able to see them, but they're right there, very, very close by, in the same house, where the family is together, everyone is there, and the only difference is they're upstairs, they're on the second floor. Let's try to envision, let's try to visualize a loved one. Try to remember what it was like when they were on the first floor. And now think about the exact same setting. What does it feel like? What does it feel like knowing that they're on the second floor? They're with us. They're with us. They're in the same house. They're only just a few feet away. Not far, far, far away. Very close by on the second floor. Take a half a minute to visualize and try to connect to this feeling of the loved one on the second floor.
So, as we continue to talk about this very sensitive subject. The point and the purpose of us discussing this is hopefully to help us feel comfortable and overcome the passing of a loved one, but also for ourselves to be comfortable in our own present state of being and recognize that this state that we are in right now, we have to continue to fight to survive every single moment, but we also have to embrace the journey that we're on. So the moment a person passes away, the nefesh, the first level of the soul, sticks to the body, but the next level, the ruach, continues to live on within us. And by the way, it also lives on within that person. The loved one who passed away also feels empowered and uplifted and inspired or ready to extend itself on a much more impactful way than it touched us until now. So while the soul touches the family while they're alive, the soul wants to continue to impact us even more so after it passes away, which is not so far-fetched from what many people say after their loved one passes away. I've seen it. People say, we're not going to mourn the passing of the person because we want to celebrate their life. Now, while that notion is a very noble notion, as we're going to see, Judaism does not necessarily disagree with that. It only says, not just yet. The person just passed away. It's okay to mourn the person. It's okay to cry over the passing. Not only it's okay, one should mourn the person. Don't just jump back into life as if nothing happened. We understand it's a nice thing what you want to do. That's excellent. But let's also allow ourselves to grieve. Why? If the soul has just freed itself from the body, remember I mentioned at the beginning of class, we talked about some contradictions. If the soul just freed itself from the body, we should be celebrating life. But at the same time, the life that we're living here is the most important life we can possibly live. Therefore, we do mourn the passing of the person because we want to see the body. What does that mean? The person can accomplish, as we mentioned last week, more while living in this world than they can accomplish when the soul is not connected to the body. At the same time, it can reach further places when it's not restricted by the body. So we're dealing with those two kind of opposing ideas at the same time. But let's continue to expound upon this. So what we're talking about now, that our ideals, our feelings, emotions, and principles are rooted in ruach. If you think about it, if you have to identify where a person's personality is, would you say it's in the part of the soul that's connected to the body, or would you say it's part of the soul that is kind of above the body, right? So because our personality has sometimes such a strong presence, and sometimes we think, wow, how did I even come up with that idea? How did I even do that thing? It's because it's coming from a place that is not restricted by the body. So sometimes we behave in a certain manner that we're actually surpassing the limitations of our body. Okay. Sometimes we do something, I don't know, where there's a cause that we take on, and we're active in that cause, and we get people together that we've never thought we're able to get people together. We get up in front of a crowd and we kind of give this incredible, powerful awakening speech or whatever it is. All of a sudden, we say, wait, where did that come from? It's because we have a part of us that is above our body. It's in our body, but it's above our body. That's the ruach spirit. That is the spirit, the part of the soul that is not constrained by the limitations of the body. So when a loved one passes on, these ideals, feelings, and principles do not vanish. They are actually intensified. and are accessible to those who love that person and seek to connect to the person through love. The more we love, the more we connect. And when we connect, we are connected to the deepest part of the loved one. Let's think about it like this. In life, we connect with people all the time. Sometimes we connect to a person on a elementary level. So let's say a little child, we connect with a child, and you dangle a little rattle in front of their face, okay? The child laughs, tries to grab the rattle. But if you do the same thing to a 5-year-old child, they'll run away. They'll think you're crazy. So we have to connect a 5-year-old child on a different level. Not with the rattle. We have to figure out a different way we could connect with the 5-year-old child. Maybe reading a book. And when the child grows up, a book is not going to cut it anymore. They don't want you hear you reading a book to them. So then we have to maybe go out to a ball game with them, or do something else more mature with that person. So as the person matures, our connection to them evolves. It evolves on a more mature level. And so it is same thing also with the loved one. As the loved one matures, in other words, as they continue to move on in their life, our connection to them continues also to move on a deeper level. So when the person passes away, the connection is not over. We're just connecting to them on even a different level.
Mhm.
And so based on this understanding, the death or the passing of a loved one does not end our connection. It just becomes a more spiritual connection. It's not limited to the contemporaries or to the finite or to the limitations of the body. Okay? So while alive, a person's ruach is confined in and only to the expressed via the nefesh. At death, the ruach is no longer limited, and its essence is accessible to all who wish to connect to it. Let's move on to the next step. On page 46, do you see it in the gray box? In transit. No one would argue that the moment of the soul's departure is not a difficult experience for the relatives. Death is always difficult and sometimes utterly crushing for the deceased loved ones. But how does the deceased experience it? Is it difficult for a freshly departed soul as well? I've always marveled at the fact that when a child is born, the child comes out crying and everybody in the room is laughing. And when a person passes away, everybody in the room is crying, but the soul is laughing. Now, what does that mean? We have to understand what that means, because there is a certain pain that the soul is going through also, as he mentioned. The soul wants to continue to live its life here on earth in a body. But at the same time, also, the soul understands that they are now going to connect to the essence. They're connecting on a much deeper level with their loved ones. And the loved ones also, while we feel pain, what is the pain that we're feeling? Is it that now we don't see the loved one? But does that mean we can't connect to the loved one also? And what we're saying today is that we could connect to the loved one. We're just going to connect on a different level. So certainly, end of life experiences are very painful. I'm not going to minimize it, not even attempt to minimize it, because that's not true. It is an extremely painful, difficult thing to experience. No question about it. But let's understand this idea. So let me pull up the next slide here. And let's talk about the next stage of the journey that the person is going through. So right before the person passes away, one second here. Let me, oops. we go. Okay. When we are standing in the room of a loved one, okay, it is very helpful when the person is on the bout to pass away. And I share this with family all the time. I tell the family, I said, don't argue in front of the person lying there, even if they're seemingly in a comatose state. They know what's happening. So don't argue in front of them. Also, only try to talk positive things. Reminisce about good memories. They're there. They hear everything. Oh, sorry. It's okay also to touch the person's hand, to have a little physical contact. I wouldn't recommend jumping on the person, as I've seen happen. That's not very good for the person, but it's okay, a little physical contact. And the presence of the loved ones around someone who's about to pass away is a very comforting and uplifting experience. I can say that, well, my father was about to pass away. Myself and my siblings were standing around his bed. We were singing Hasidic songs, and there's no question about it. That was a very spiritual experience for us, but also for him. We believe that it brought a certain degree of comfort to the soul. We have to believe that because the soul, remember, is still attached to the body and it's still alive. And even as the soul continues to journey to the next level, it is journeying with that song, with that tune, with that good feeling, the friendliness, the good contacts, and being surrounded by the loved ones is an incredibly powerful moment that the soul can experience as it transitions from this world into the next world. Now, at the same time, there's no question about it. Let's look at text number 2, page 47. Nothing is as hard for the soul as its separation from the body. Although the soul knows it is journeying and it's going to continue to journey and continue to look out for the family, at the same time, it is a very difficult move for the body. The soul doesn't want to depart from the body. Why is it difficult? So let's understand exactly what is going on over here. The difficulty of the soul. Number one, it is, at the end of the day, it's the ultimate transition. The moment the person dies, that's it. This person will never be here on earth again, as we see it, as we know it. We're going to talk in a later class about reincarnation, but even reincarnation is coming down to this world in a different form, in a different degree. But this person, as we know it, in the picture that we have in the mind, we will never see them again. And that person, for us, it's difficult. And for the person dying, it's difficult. They know it's the ultimate transition. And all transitions, even necessary and positive ones, are hard. Have you ever moved? It wasn't easy. You were happy to move. You moved to a bigger house or to another city. It still was difficult. And I always try to remind people when they complain about their moves, I say, you wanted to move, you chose to move. It's a good move. Just say thank you, God, for allowing me to be able to move. But it's hard. Any transition is difficult. We can't deny that. Number two, the soul understands that no longer is it in a body, and therefore it can no longer do a mitzvah. It can't smile anymore at someone. It can't bring challah to someone. It can't invite someone to their house. It can't go anymore to visit the sick. It can't embrace somebody. It can't put on tefillin or can't light the Shabbos candles. This is why this transition is very difficult for the soul. And number three, there's more than number three, but for now, number three, a powerful bond is broken. After all, the body and the soul have learned to live with each other for these 80, 90, 120 years that it lived together. You see, the body is interested in physical things, sleeping, eating, drinking. The soul is interested in spiritual things, doing mitzvahs, studying, praying. And throughout life, the body and the soul learn to live with each other. And in fact, as we get older, we complement each other. The soul tells the body, I'll let you hit snooze once and sleep another 5 minutes. And the body says, after I sleep, we'll go to the synagogue. everybody's happy. And so this powerful bond that has been created over these years that we live together have now been broken. And so therefore, it is very painful for the person to die and painful for the family to see anybody and be present when somebody passes away. And this is why, according to Jewish tradition, we have very specific and detailed ways we mourn for the loss of a person. I'd like to go through some of these ways that we mourn for a person. And in my position as a rabbi, I definitely like to do more weddings than funerals. I like to be at more circumcisions than funerals. And I like to be at more births or more bar mitzvahs or bat mitzvahs than visit someone in hospice. No question about it. But the reality is that people pass away. And for us, the living, we have to know that there's no shortcuts to mourning. And it's interesting that I was once at a funeral not too long ago, and I was talking to the funeral director, not a Jewish guy, and he was telling me that I was talking to him how many years he's doing this and so on and so forth. It's a job that I don't know anybody would voluntarily take that type of job, but anyway. So he was telling me, he says, one thing I can tell you is that the Jewish traditions that surround death and dying and mourning are incredibly healthy and comforting for the mourner and for the person that passed away. I say this because there's really no shortcuts. If somebody passed away, you want to go back to work. We don't want to sit for 7 days for the Shiva. But in the long term, the brilliance of this process helps us, the survivors, move on, and it also helps the person who passed away. So but in order to understand the stages of mourning, we have to take a step back and understand what exactly happens when the person dies, okay? And essentially, there's 4 stages in the soul's departure from the body. On text number 3, we'll read inside. For 3 days, the soul hovers over the body, thinking that it can return to it. After 3 days, when it sees that the body's face has changed, it leaves the body and departs. Stage number 1 is 3 days. The soul hovers over the body. The soul doesn't want to leave the body. Remember, that transition is very difficult. This is why, for the first 3 days, the pain of the person that passed away is the strongest. It is like raw pain. We almost don't feel like eating, don't feel like talking to anybody. It's just raw nerve. It's just very difficult because as a survivor, we almost feel the presence of the soul hovering over the body. It's like, how can I even move on? How can I do anything when this is what's happening? Then we have the next stage, which is the 7 days. Now, it's not 7 days in addition to the 3 days. It's part of the 3 days, but the next 4 days, it's 7 in total. The soul vacillates between the grave and its home. As we see in text 4a, for 7 days, the soul goes from the house where it lived to the grave, and from the grave back to the house, and it mourns its body. After 7 days, the body is subjected to its fate, and the soul ascends to its place. The next stage, text 4b, is the 30 days. For 30 days, the soul and the body are judged as one, and thus the soul is located down here on earth. After that, the soul ascends while the body erodes on earth. And the next stage is the first 12 months, where the soul vacillates between heaven and earth. For 12 months, the body still exists, and the soul ascends and descends. After 12 months, the body becomes null, and the soul rises and no longer returns. I have to explain what this means. We started off the class talking about 2 different souls. the soul that we're talking about now that leaves the body is the ruach, is the second stage of consciousness, the second soul. The first level of the soul remains with the body forever, which is why we go visit the grave, because the soul, the original soul, or the first level of the soul with the body is still there. This other level of the soul is what continues to move on from stage to stage. Okay? And so we have phases of mourning. Mourners observe in text 5, 3 days of weeping, 7 days of eulogies, and for 30 days restrictions on haircuts and wearing freshly ironed clothes, marrying, joining a celebration of friends, and traveling on business. So for the first 7 days, we essentially stay home, called Shiva. We sit and we talk about our loved ones. Family and friends come to visit us and spend time with us and share stories of our loved ones. For the first 30 days, we kind of enter back into society. We go back into the world, but we're still mourning. We don't take a haircut for 30 days. We don't buy new clothing. We try to minimize joyous occasions. And finally, the first 12 months, again, we're still considered in a stage of mourning. And in fact, we say Kaddish for 11 months. We'll talk in a moment why. Only 11 months, not the full 12 months. And after the 12 months, by the yard site, then the mourning period is officially over. And every year on the yard site, we once again commemorate this person's passing. Now, by no means does this insinuate that we forget about our loved one. 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years later, we still remember our loved one, sometimes every day. Time does heal, meaning to say, I always tell people, I say, now that you've lost a loved one, your heart has been broken. Time is on your side, but it will not repair the brokenness of your heart. It'll help you live with a broken heart. So the moment the person passes away, your heart is broken. You feel like you can't go on. Time will allow you to continue to live with a broken heart, but it cannot repair the heart. That has forever broken. But God gave us the gift that we can move on and we can continue to live. There's no shortcuts. It's okay to allow ourselves these stages of mourning. Let's look at text number 6, please. Sheila, you want to read, please?
Did you say Shira?
Shira, go ahead. Yes, you're unmuted. Go.
Okay. I'm sorry. What page were we on?
53.
Okay.
Text 6.
Okay. Extended mourning?
Yeah.
Okay. If you encounter an acquaintance within 30 days of that person having lost a next of kin, offer words of consolation and avoid the customary pleasantries. If 30 days have elapsed since the relative's passing, greet your acquaintance in the usual manner and offer indirect words of consolation. Avoid mentioning the deceased by name and extend a generic consolation, such as, may you be comforted. If your acquaintance is mourning the loss of a parent, you should offer direct messages of comfort for the first 12 months, and only after that scale it back to indirect consolation. If a person dies and leaves no next of kin to be comforted, 10 people should go and sit in the deceased's home. A man died in Rabbi Yehuda's neighborhood. As there were no mourners to be comforted, Rabbi Yehuda assembled 10 people every day, and they sat in the deceased's home. After 7 days, the dead man appeared to Rabbi Yehuda in a dream and said, may your mind be at rest, for you have set my mind at rest.
Thank you very much. Now, it's important to point out, and today, in today's world, it's a little bit different than the way it used to be. even many of us remember how it used to be. And that was that a person essentially pretty much lived in their house until they passed away. So their house was their haven, and their presence is felt in their house. When you walked into your grandmother's house, you smelled your grandmother almost. That was the house. You can identify everything about your grandmother just by stepping into that door. All the memories of your childhood visitations, everything is right there. Today, it's not so much like that. Sometimes we put our parent in a home. Sometimes we move them into our home. And so the parent's personality is not necessarily, even if we move them into our home, they have their own room, but it's still our home and our personality, not necessarily their personality. But the point is that where the person lived, that's where they kind of express themselves. You know, your home is your, you take a house and you make it a home. You make it your own thing. You never walk into someone's house and start moving furniture around. You know, I don't like the way the couch is. You put it, turn it to the other side. I don't like the way this lamp is. You kind of move it to the other side of the room. The person will throw you out of the house. You know, in a hotel room, we don't do it either, but still the hotel room is impersonal. But a house, you kind of feel that person has a certain personality, that they like the way their couch is in a certain way, their tables, their chairs, or whatever it is. Even their couch pillows are strategically placed that reflects that person's personality. So even though we don't have it today, going into someone's house, or when a person passes away, they may not be in the house. Nonetheless, as children, as descendants of that person, by sitting around with our loved ones, we kind of still, and talk about the person we love, we are still keeping their presence with us during that Shiva, during that 7-day mourning period. And this is why we try to keep the conversation about the person who passed away. Talk about their life, their soul, their impacts that they had on others. And this helps us connect to that person. So death is difficult for the soul because it is a transition. Also, the soul and body integrate and bond. The separation is therefore painful. There are 4 stages of the soul's departure from the body, corresponding to the stages of mourning. When we mourn, we are mourning not only for the deceased, but also with the deceased. This is very important to distinct. We're not just talking for the person, but also with the person. The comforters come to comfort the mourners and the soul of the deceased. So now that we understand a little bit that the person consists of the body and the soul, and part of the soul remains with the body, another aspect of the soul continues to live on, our connection to the body and the soul throughout this transition, throughout this change, throughout this period that our loved one is passing away, and we are continuing to be there and reflecting upon them, and how we take care of our loved one the moments before they pass away, being there, surrounding them with positive thoughts, positive actions. We also remember another very important thing. And the reason why we take such good care of our loved ones while they're alive and as they're passing away is because our main focus is not just the soul. Let me explain. So when you see somebody, when you first meet someone, the hope is that you don't judge them by their body. Hopefully you look beyond the body. You look at the person and you try to connect to their soul level, to their personality. We don't just want to be left with the facade of the person. We want to really dig a little bit deeper, right? Understand who we're talking to, appreciate their essence. Of course, in a normal day-to-day activity, that takes time to get to know somebody. A tzaddik, a righteous person, can see someone for the first time, gaze into their eyes, and see their soul. What does it say? The eyes are a window to the soul. So if you can look into someone's eyes, which is why when you give someone a handshake or when you talk to someone, you should look them in their eyes. When you look at their eyes, you're kind of gazing into a much deeper perspective, a deeper aspect within that person. But at the same time, as we've been talking, the body is also very important. The body that we house our soul in is a gift from God. It is given to us for us to carry it, to take care of it, and to utilize it to fulfill our mission and our purpose in this world. For this reason, after the person passes away, it's very important that we also take care of the body. So let's talk a little bit about that. Handling of the body. As an introduction, when I typically do a funeral, I always wait for the grave to be completely filled, and only then do I leave. And in fact, while even since COVID, it doesn't really happen, but usually there's a service in the mortuary or something, and then you go to the cemetery. The service at the mortuary, you say psalms, eulogies, whatever it is, and then there's the section at the cemetery. The bigger mitzvah really is not to come to the mortuary. The bigger mitzvah is to be at the cemetery, meaning to say, there's a mitzvah called halvayas hames, accompanying the dead. It's a mitzvah to follow the dead and to follow it till it's buried. So that's the mitzvah, is to be there, to follow the person and to be there. During COVID, it was very challenging for many family members to be at the presence of the person. And as we're going to talk in a moment, a person should try to bury the loved ones as quickly as possible, even though sometimes it's okay to wait if family's coming in from out of state or overseas, as long as it's not too long, because that also adds honor to the person that's being buried. But we try to do it as quickly as possible. Why? Because the body is a sanctified place and is a very holy thing. It helped the soul fulfill its mission on earth. So we have to treat the body in this manner. This is why we follow, even though the soul is living on, but we still follow the body, take care of the body, make sure that from the moment of its passing until it's buried, the body is taken care of. So I'm going to go through a couple steps just so we understand some of the things that we do while the body is We went through this, the 4 stages of mourning, degree of mourning. We mourn for the soul, but ultimately we mourn with the soul. Okay, so this halvayat hames, escorting the dead. The deceased senses our presence and appreciates it. This is why it's a big mitzvah. And there's actually a law that if there's a cemetery in a community, then all the stores are supposed to close and go to accompany the dead, even just for a few feet. You have to leave your store, leave your house, go and accompany the dead. So let's see this next step. What happens to the body? The human being begins as flesh and bones. In fact, let's turn to page 55, please. And we're going to ask Sheila Freed to please read text number 8A. Unmute yourself. Got it? Sheila, you got it? Okay, we'll ask Mona, can you unmute yourself and go to text 8A, please?
One who is present at the time of a person's passing is required to tear their clothing. This is because a person's passing is likened to the burning of a Torah scroll.
Read 8B, please. Continue. Mona.
Nachmanides points to the sacred names of God that are inked onto his Torah scrolls parchment as an analogy for the sacred soul that is installed within the corporeal body.
Thank you. So essentially what we're saying here is that, by the way, this law, for whatever reason, I'm not really sure why, doesn't apply. So even though you're standing next to someone that passed away, people typically do not, other than relatives, don't tear their clothing. But we tear our clothing. Why do we tear our clothing? A loved one is supposed to tear their clothing, not a ribbon, but actually their clothing, is because it's compared to a Torah scroll. What does that mean? So the human being begins as flesh and bones. A Torah scroll begins as animal hide. The human being has a soul that is infused to it. The animal hide, what was once animal hide, now has God's name inscribed upon it. Similarities between the person and the Torah. The body becomes holy. When we do a mitzvah, now we are holy. Every human being is holy. It's cherished, it's valued, it's unbelievable. The same thing also with the Torah scroll. The parchment becomes holy. So if God forbid a Torah scroll falls on the floor, the entire community is supposed to fast for 40 days. If a Torah scroll is torn, then we have to tear kriya. We have to rent our clothing. When a person falls on the floor, except if you're in Manhattan. If you're in Manhattan and someone falls on the floor, no one even looks your way. But other than Manhattan, someone falls on the floor, everyone jumps to try to help that person get up. A person fell. They don't belong on the floor, right? Subconsciously, we recognize the holiness of the human being, the preciousness of the human being. That person shouldn't have fallen. If a baby falls on the floor, we pick them up. It's an instinctive reaction. Why? Because we recognize the uniqueness, the holiness of that person, of that being. And so this is why we tear our clothing. In other words, the point is that we are very affected or impacted, I should say, by this passing of this human being. So just like a Torah scroll is treated with the utmost respect, and in fact, where is it? Do you know where a Torah scroll is held? Do you know what is it called? The place with which we keep the Torah scroll. Do you know what it's called in Hebrew? Anybody know? You can unmute yourself. If you don't know the Hebrew word, you can say the English. Anybody?
In the ark?
Yeah.
Ark,
No.
excellent, very good. So it's
So
called
the-
the Holy Ark. Excellent, thank you. Or the Aron HaKodesh. The Hebrew word is Aron for ark.
Oh,
Where do we place a dead person? You know what the term, the Hebrew word for a coffin is? Aron. The same word that is used for an ark is also used for a person that we place. The coffin is called an Aron, just like the Torah. The Torah is wrapped up. When a person passes away, they're also wrapped in shrouds. So everything that happens with the person is actually a mirror image of the Torah scroll. The person is so holy. This is why every moment we're alive, we want to maximize our time here infuse the world with Torah, with holiness, with goodness, because we are so special, such a gift of God to the world, each and every one of us. So after a person passes away, then we can't mistreat the body. No way. So what do? There are pre-burial rites and rules. I'd just like to make a special mention that on this call with us in our class, we have a woman who actually volunteers with the Chevra Kadisha. The Chevra Kadisha is called the Holy Society. The Holy Society are a group of volunteers that prepare the body for burial. It's not a fun job, but it is a very special and unique and holy job. If anybody would like to volunteer with that, you can contact me, or I'll let you know this woman, because typically men take care of men, women take care of women, to retain the dignity and the respect of the person, of the deceased. And this is why there are certain things that we do with a person that passes away. First of all, the body has to be handled with respect and dignity, such as it has to be cleaned and dressed in shrouds. The people that are preparing the body cannot have any casual conversations. This is a serious time. This is a serious thing that we're doing over here. You can't just have a fun, casual conversation. You're dealing with a human being here. Next, the person should remain covered at all times. We clean the person, but body part by body part. You don't want to undress the person. It's not nice. It's not respectful. Also, the person is never placed face down. It can be found, by the way, in your book on page 59, all these stages also. It's not nice. It's not respectful for the person to be placed face down. You're almost like hiding that person. Therefore, the person is face up. The person also is always guarded. 24 hours a day, someone stands guard by that person. All of these things are to maintain respect for the dead. Now, one may ask, come on, we're talking about the soul. The soul is the most important thing. This is just the body. Big deal. The body's dead. It's just a piece of flesh and bones. The answer is, as we've been talking, that according to Judaism, no, your body is a miniature Torah scroll. It is holy. It is special. It is a gift from God. This is why throughout our lifetime, we treat it with respect. We don't abuse our body. And even after we die, we take care of it in the most respectful manner. Which is also why a person that, unfortunately, we shouldn't know of it, has to have a body part amputated, that body part also has to be buried. And in fact, there's an organization in Israel called Zaka that after the terrorist attacks, when terrorists are blowing themselves up and killing Jews, so the Jews literally blew up. I don't want to be too graphic, but this organization, Zaka, would go and scrape these body parts off the street, off the walls, and clean up the blood and bury it with the dead to give them the proper Jewish burial. Why? Because the body is holy, it's very special. In fact, my father, I shared this before, my father passed away while he was being operated on. He was going for a heart transplant and the heart didn't take. And so we had to take his old heart that was already out of the body and all the pipes and everything else and bury it together with my father. So when somebody passes away, for example, they have a trachea. So according to Jewish law, you're supposed to cut out the trachea, or even if it's pulled out, then take that part that has blood on it or tissue, and that has to be buried as well. Because every part of the person is holy, is special. Any part of the body, which is also why if a person bleeds, we should, again, unfortunately, when they're passing away, we roll up the sheets and we bury that also. Even fluids that come from the person's body while they're alive is considered holy, and the person has to be buried with those things. So what is the point of all this? The body of a Jew is analogous to the parchment of a Torah scroll. The underlying principle that guides the care for a corpse is the dignity and sensitivity with which all the preparations are done. Even after death, the body retains its special status of having been the garment of the soul. Now, because we're talking about this, I have to share with you something that is very near to my heart, that really bothers me very much. So allow me to talk about it. And if I hopefully I'm not offending anybody, but and that is, I've seen too often that Jews do not make proper preparations for what's going to happen after they pass away. And for this reason, the loved ones, while they mean well, they don't really know how, and of course it's a tumultuous time. It's a very emotional time. There's a lot of pressure. Everything's happening so fast. We don't know. We're getting calls, this, that. It's a crazy time. And so unfortunately, many times people make the wrong decision. I'll give you an example that happened just this week. This guy passed away, and he told his wife, he was Jewish, his wife wasn't Jewish. And so he told his wife that he wants to have he wants to be buried in shrouds, which is the Jewish way, and wants to be buried in a pine coffin, which is the Jewish way. And so she's a wonderful woman, his wife, and she wanted to follow his direction. But she didn't know more than that. That's all she knew. And so she called a non-Jewish mortuary here in town. And the non-Jewish mortuary said, yeah, no problem. We have shrouds. We can give you a simple coffin. No problem. And she didn't know where else to go. And so she went to this place, this non-Jewish mortuary. This non-Jewish mortuary says, yeah, we do Jewish people. We know how to do a Jewish burial, prepare it, all these things. And which is really categorically a lie. It's not true because they don't have the facilities to do the purification of the body, to wash the body, as we say. They don't treat the body with dignity as a Jew is supposed to treat the body with dignity. They didn't either wash the body as is supposed to happen with the body. As all these things we've mentioned, the conversations are different when someone is not trained to have the proper conversations next to the body. There's a huge difference between preparing a body in a Jewish place and a non-Jewish place. So this woman, again, a super nice lady, and I tried to help as much as possible. No fault of her own, but I try to tell, it just bothers me that he was clear about that he wants a Jewish burial, but not clear enough what it means to have a Jewish burial. So it's very important that everyone that's here now on the phone call makes the proper preparations and very clear exactly what we want, who should take care of us in a Jewish mortuary, so the body is properly taken care of and treated in the proper, respectful manner that a Jewish body should be taken care of. That's my first, what's it called? My soapbox that I'm going to share. But now we're going to come to another very delicate and sensitive thing. And this is a very, very sensitive and delicate subject, but it's very important to talk about it also today. It's important to talk about it because it is becoming a more and more of an issue today than it was even 15, 20 years ago. And I just want to preface that I truly, sincerely hope that I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. So I really hope that what I'm going to say now will not offend anyone, but it's important to learn about it. So sometimes we make a decision because we didn't know better. And according to Jewish law, ignorance of the law is a defense. Unlike in America, ignorance of the law is not a defense. In Jewish law, it is a defense. But nonetheless, we should try to learn about it so we can know what does Jewish law say about this specific subject that I'm going to talk about now. So someone made a decision based on not knowing, they're not held accountable. It's not their fault. But nonetheless, as a Jew, we should learn about it. And again, also make sure we make the proper preparations. Just to give you a little example, in 1960, only 3.6% of Americans did this thing that I'm going to talk about in a second. In 2018, it was up to 53%. And according to statistics, in 2035, it's going to be up to 78%. What I'm talking about now is cremation. According to Jewish law, cremation is a major no-no. Right? We're not allowed to burn the body, destroy the body. But let me explain what I'm saying, and we'll try to talk about it in the most sensitive manner as possible. As an introduction, throughout my 22 years of being here, I've been very fortunate to be involved in helping families through this very difficult period of the family member passing away. There have been many times, more than 10 times, that the deceased had requested to be cremated. And I was very lucky to be able to convince the family to bury the person and not cremate the person. And I'm going to explain in a minute what I mean. unfortunately, more than 20 times, I've been unsuccessful and the person has been cremated. So why does Judaism oppose cremation? What is the problem with cremation? So let's have a little discussion about this so we can understand what is the Jewish view. And I think what we spoke about until now, we already addressed some of it, the sanctity of the body, the sanctity of the soul with the body, that after a person's buried, there's a part of the soul that remains with the body, and the soul continues to hover over the body, watches over the body. So it's very painful for the soul to see the body being burnt or being destroyed to ashes. There was a Chabad rabbi that was invited to speak to 4,000 other Chabad rabbis at the annual convention of Chabad rabbis in New York a couple years ago. And he shared a story that he got a call one day from a woman who sounded frantic on the phone. And she said her father had just passed away, and her father's new wife wants to cremate her father. So she's calling the rabbi if he could do anything about it. Now, the rabbi never met this man, and so he really wasn't sure how he can help out, but he took the second wife's information, and the daughter gave it to him, and he went to her to meet this woman. And he says, "Why do you want to cremate your husband?" And she said, "Because I cannot imagine my husband. I love my husband so much, and I care about him so much. I can't imagine him being eaten by maggots." Okay. And so it's a good argument, right? So the rabbi thought for a second, and he said, "Have you ever held a match to your palm of your hand? How does that feel? Could you imagine being burnt in 2,000 degrees? That you could imagine your husband going through? Such a horrific, painful experience." So what does Judaism tell us? Why is it that Judaism is so pro or so into this idea of burial and has such a hard time dealing with this idea of cremation? So first of all, I like to discuss some of the rationales or some of the arguments for cremation, and then we will talk about what is the Jewish approach to all these things. So I just want to reiterate, my point of this discussion is not to offend anyone. It's really just to educate. And I believe in this very much. And it really bothers me when someone is not brought to Kvuras Yisrael, as it's called, to Jewish burial. The eternality of being able to go visit a person's grave cannot be compared to anything else. So one is money, financing, economics. It's very expensive to bury someone. Another argument is no one's going to go visit. No one's going to come visit me. So I might as well be cremated and my ashes thrown in the ocean or whatever, or in my favorite spot, they're over Bloomingdale's, as the old joke goes. So that's because that's when my daughter's going to come visit me, how they say. Anyway, so, or today it's Nordstrom. Does Bloomingdale still exist? I don't know. Anyway, so Saks Fifth Avenue, whatever. The point is, so no one's going to come visit me. Why should I be buried? It's not convenient. It's convenient. You burn the person, finish, done. You don't have to take care of the grave forever. You don't have all these headaches. Also, another argument is it's not good for the environment. You're taking up too much space, and we're going to run out of space soon. And that although in Arizona, that's really not a valid argument because we have so much space. And even in Europe, where everyone lives on top of each other, there's enough space for burial. Still till today, in New York, there's always place for burial. The point is, so what exactly do we say to all these things? So first of all, and I'd like to tell you that many of these instances was a financial thing that people wanted to cremate their loved ones. And I took it upon myself to raise the money, and there are funds for it. So I always tell families, don't let that stand in the way of you having a Jewish burial. We'll raise the money for it. Don't worry about it. The most important thing is that you should have a Jewish burial. And so therefore, anyone writing a will, if you wrote your will, just make sure you put in there that what type of burial you want. You want a Jewish burial. And under no circumstances should we opt for this other option that is out there, that it's Americanized or whatever. I don't know what term it is, but it's certainly not a Jewish way. Regarding the visitation, it's true, sometimes we live in different states. It's a valid thing. But nonetheless, if we cremate someone, then there's no hope, certainly no hope that anyone will ever come to visit them. If we bury them, at least there's a chance that someone's going to come visit them. And in fact, I've seen someone that's cremated, there's no going back on it. It's done. Someone that's buried, if after 20 years you see it's not worth it, all right, then you can change your mind. I've yet to find someone that changed their mind. I found someone change their mind from cremation and they regretted it. I've never found someone that buried their loved one and regretted that. I've yet to see that. So if you're not sure of a visitation, bury the person. That's what God says, God wants. You'll see the rewards for that. And for the environmental argument, we know that it's actually more green to bury the person according to Jewish law, because the fumes that the carcinogens that are released from a person being cremated is a much worse for the environment than the person decomposing in the ground. That's all physical, technical things. And here is a very sensitive issue, and that is that many times family, again, they don't know that it's not a Jewish thing, and they'll write in their will that they want to be cremated. And this is really one area where I tell families that we have to go against their against the loved one's wishes and bury them. If someone wrote in their will that after I die, I want you to burn my neighbor's house, are you going to say, oh, they wrote in the will, I have to listen to them, I can't go against them, right? But of course, we're not going to listen to the person if they just say something so ridiculous. So according to Jewish law, this is also a very ridiculous thing. So even though the loved one said it, we still should try to do what we can to respect their soul's desire and not their external desire that was influenced by the ideas of the world. So, what is really going on here? Why is cremation such a bad thing according to Judaism? And essentially, when someone opts to be cremated, they're, in a way, what's the word? They are not neglecting, but they're going against a few tenets of Jewish law. What exactly is that? According to Jewish law, second, okay. Our bodies are on loan to us. Our bodies really belong to God. We have no right to cut ourselves, to break our fingers, or do anything to hurt our body. We got it from God, and God says, here, I'm giving you this body so you can function as a human being and you can be productive. Which, by the way, is also a perspective unrelated to our discussion, but it's a perspective that when someone is born with, God forbid, a handicap, it is also given to this person received it from God, the way the person was born. And so when we see it as a gift from God, Yitzchak Perlman, the famous violinist, recognized this handicap that God gave him. And he said, wait a second, if I was given this handicap, I also have another gift that God gave me to compensate for that handicap. So whatever God gave us, our bodies, the way it is, the shape, the height, the size, anything is a gift from God. Our job is to return it to God. He gave it to us on loan. We have to give it back to God as he gave it to us. Number two, therefore, it's not for us to decide how to inter the body. God decides. What did God tell us? God said very clearly, that one comes from dust and returns to dust. It's written in the book of Genesis and also in the book of Deuteronomy. Look at text number 14 on page 63. For you are dust, and you will return to dust. The body comes from the earth, and it is entrusted as a deposit to the individual's care. Upon death, the deposit must be returned to the earth from where it came and buried there. The Israeli army has a term, and I think an American army has it as well, which is a very noble thing. No soldier left behind. If someone is injured or killed on the battlefield, we will make sure to bring that person back to their homeland. And in Israel, they get a proper burial. We're still fighting for some soldiers that have been captured till today, POWs, MIAs, whatever it is, and we're still looking for them. We're still fighting for them. We never give up. Just, I think it was 2 years ago, there was a few POWs, that even though they have died, but Israel did a what is it called? A transfer, not transfer is the wrong word. They gave some Arabs that were in prison to get even the dead body of the Jew back home. Why? So you can have a proper Jewish burial. That's how important we understand this idea of Jewish burials. Prisoner exchange. It was an exchange. For live people, even for a dead person is still a Jew, still needs a proper Jewish burial. Doesn't matter. There's no such thing as a dead body. It's as we said, it's a living, breathing soul that's still alive. We have to care for it. This is why we make sure it gets a proper Jewish burial. But even more so, that is that when someone says they want to be cremated, in a way, they are going against a fundamental belief. And there's two beliefs in Judaism that we talk about the passing of a person. And one is that with the coming of Mashiach, it says that in the 13 principles of faith, that there will be a resurrection of the dead. When a person is cremated, there's nothing to be resurrected. When a person is laid in the ground, their soul is still with them. Even though the body many times decomposes, there's still some bones that remain, but the soul is still in there in the grave. And from that, this person gets resurrected. When a person is cremated, unfortunately, they're no longer. So they're denying this belief in the resurrection of the dead. And they're also denying the number one, that our bodies come from God. If a person says, I want to be cremated, they said, I'm in charge of my body. And that is a fundamental belief that is missing. Let's skip to text, page 64, text 15a and 15b. It is a mitzvah to implement the expressed final wishes of the deceased. So if a deceased has a wish, we have to follow their wishes. However, in 15b, we say if a person requests not to be buried, we disregard the request. This is because burial is a mitzvah, as it is stated, you shall bury them. So if someone says while they're alive, cut off my arm, God forbid, we wouldn't do it, right? You wouldn't hurt somebody while they're alive. If you don't listen to them while they're alive, then also after they're dead, we don't listen to someone that is saying that we should hurt them spiritually. This is why we go against it. And in fact, it is actually, I've seen it. It's the greatest gift for the family to really bury the loved one, even after the person wrote in the will that they want to be cremated. Again, I'm a young man, so you don't have to take my word for it. But from my few years of experience, I can tell you, when a family did not listen to the loved one and bury the person, they come back to me years later to thank me for encouraging them to do the right thing. Because ultimately, that's where a Jew belongs, in the ground. So this is why, even though we have to respect everything the loved one says, but it comes to burial, we don't do that. Now, this is why, according to Jewish law, just to continue with this cremation thing, so prohibition against cremation, the association of Judaism's core beliefs, as we said, denying the resurrection of the dead and that God gave us the body. And cremation constitutes irrevocable statement, saying that I'm nothing, I'm done. There's nothing left of me. So it's a mitzvah to Implement the express wishes of the deceased. If a person requests not to be buried, we disregard this request. And administering a Jewish burial is granting what a deceased wants presently. So even though while they were alive, they thought they wanted to be buried, but really they thought they wanted cremation, but really their soul certainly wants to be buried. This is why throughout the year, there's certain times that we go to visit a grave. And by the way, even if we go to someone else's grave, it's still as if we are connecting to our loved ones. If you've been to a funeral, many times I see people at a funeral. You know the story with the guy that was at a funeral. This rich man died and he left a lot of money, millions of dollars, to charities and to his family. The rabbi was giving this eulogy and he sees the stranger crying. So he asks the stranger, he says, "Why are you crying? Are you related to this person?" So the guy says, "No." So he says, "So why are you crying?" He says, "That's why." Anyway, so back to the story. So if you've been to a funeral, you've noticed that people cry at the funeral. I've always wondered why people are crying so strongly or so passionately. Now, obviously, family and close friends will cry. That's something that does. Any friend will cry. But sometimes you see people that are, I don't know, acquaintances, we'll call them, okay? And they're crying. And I don't know if I did the right thing, but once I asked someone, I says, why, you crying? Do you know the person? They said, no. So why are you crying so strongly? And they said that they're by a funeral and they're remembering their own personal loss. So we go to a funeral, although we're crying for the person that's buried, and we should cry for that person, because after all, we're going to miss that person, no question about it. It's a very beautiful thing, and it's okay to cry. But a lot of times it brings back memories of our own losses. So when we go to a cemetery, we're not only visiting our loved ones, or we go to any cemetery, sometimes it reminds us even of our loved ones if they're in a different state. So visiting the grave is a very important thing. It's respect for the departed, is the point. Also, it shows that the memory has not been forgotten. Now, I want to make a point to this slide, that the memory has not been forgotten. Someone can argue that if I cremated a loved one and their urn is sitting on my fireplace, so they're not forgotten either, right? That's a good argument. So what would you say to that? And the answer is that it's true, their ashes are on your thing, but the person and the soul is not there. And after all, we now understand the value of the soul and how it interacts with the body. That's not just the body, it's also the soul together with the body. And that is only remains together with the burial when it's together. And of course, it reinforces our continuous connection with our loved one. So evoking the soul's sympathy. Let's see text number 16. Galina, you want to read, please? One second. Actually, there's no, I'm going to skip I'm going to skip this. We're going to go to the final letter over here. So I remember I mentioned at the beginning of the class that I'm going to read a letter that the Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote to my great aunt. I had a great aunt, her name is Chana Sharfstein, and her father and mother survived the war. And my great grandfather he was a rabbi in Stockholm, Sweden during the war. And he finally came to the United States and he got a position as a rabbi in Boston, Massachusetts. And New Year's Eve, he was walking from the synagogue to his home through the park, and a bunch of drunk kids or whatever attacked him and killed him right there in Boston. A few years later, my great grandmother passed away just from the sheer pain of the loss of her husband. So she also passed away. So my grandmother is the older sister, and her younger sister, Chana, was a few years younger. She was a teenager at the time. Anyway, she got married, and after a second year of her marriage, her mother-in-law passed away. So here she's a young girl who experienced so much pain and suffering. So she wrote a letter to the Rebbe and crying her heart out. This is not right. What's going on over here? So let's look at text 18 on page 68. Let's see what the Rebbe writes. This is just part of the letter, but I think it helps give us some insight into what we've been talking about. A blessing and greeting. I received your undated letter in which you write about your emotional upsets in connection with the passing of your mother and the questions which are troubling you in this connection, involving also questions in regard to the passing of your father. Peace unto them. His name was Yaakov Yisrael Zuber, and my great-grandmother's name was Lata Zuber. And this is a letter that the Rebbe wrote. Another fundamental point to remember, which has a direct bearing on your letter, is that all believers in God believe also in the survival of the soul. Actually, this principle has even been discovered in the physical world, where science now holds as an absolute truth that nothing in the physical world can be absolutely destroyed. How much more so in the spiritual world, especially in the case of the soul, which in no way can be affected by the death and disintegration of the physical body. It would be silly and illogical to assume that because a certain organ of the body ceases to function, affecting other physical organs of the body, that the spiritual soul would also be affected thereby. The truth is that when the physical body ceases to function, the soul continues its existence, not only as before, but even on a higher level, inasmuch as it is no longer handicapped by restraints of the physical frame. Thirdly, the attachment of children to their parents and the general attachment between close relatives during life on this earth is surely not a physical attachment by the respective physical bodies of the relatives. Essentially, the attachment is a spiritual one, due to the spiritual affinity between those concerned and the qualities of the soul, including such spiritual things as character, kindness, goodness, etc., all of which are attributed of the attributes of the soul and not of the body. Therefore, also every action on the part of a person in relation to a beloved person and the desire to benefit that person is not directed towards pleasing his physical body, his bones and tissue, for it is a spiritual pleasure that one is concerned with. In the view of the above, it is clear that even after the physical body has disintegrated and disappeared from view, it is still possible to bring joy and benefit to the soul, which, as noted above, not only survives, but does so on a higher level. And all the things which had previously brought joy and pleasure to one's parents will continue to do so even after they are physically no longer here. So we see that the main points of this lesson contains this idea that there's a continuous connection between the soul of the deceased and the loved ones in this world, and we can continue to connect to them. So I like to just reiterate again that if anyone has written a will, I ask that you please be very specific and clear about your Jewish desires to have a Jewish burial, what that means. If you're bold enough, which I encourage everyone to make preparations to do that also, it's an omen for long life. You buy a plot to make arrangements with the mortuary, whatever it is. Also remind, if someone has been cremated, a loved one, don't feel bad about it. Not everybody knows about these laws. They cannot held accountable. They're still holy. As a side note, people always ask me, what about the Jews that were burnt in the gas chambers? So certainly these people are holy. It was involuntary. If someone, God forbid, burns in a car crash or a fire, that's not their problem. They didn't do it on their own. So they're not held accountable. But those that were burnt, Kiddush Hashem, for the sanctification of God's name, like those in the Holocaust, they're very holy. But voluntarily, we're not allowed to do it. So we have to be careful. If you know someone that does have it in their will, you should try to change it now, because it's very, very hard for a family member to go against the will of a loved one that already wrote it in the will. So if they wrote it, let's try to change it. If they didn't write it yet, let's write only a Jewish burial. And again, we'll make sure that the person is treated with respect, with dignity, with honor, because after all, a human being consists of the body and the soul, and both are critical for Hashem. There was a question in the chat box there. So someone asked, I've heard from friends in Israel that there are only 600,000 who have their souls lasting. Is that true? So that it's an excellent point. Essentially, if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or write it in the chat box. So the way it works is there are 600,000 source souls. So what is a soul? A soul is not a physical entity. A soul is a spiritual entity. Think about it as a candle. So if you have a candle, from one candle, you can light 10 candles. The original candle does not get any less. So the same thing is also, there are 600,000 new souls. And many of our souls, most of our souls, are reincarnated souls. What does that mean? It has its own distinct personality. It's a new candle taken from a previous candle. It's its own distinct candle. The old one still retains its identity completely, but we have now our own personality also completely. So it's a new identity. It's part of an original soul. It's a reincarnation of an original soul. And we're going to talk about this in the next lessons. I thank you for joining me tonight. It was a pleasure learning together. We continue to get together for happy and positive discussion. I know this is a heavy discussion, but again, something that, as you can see, I'm very passionate about, very important, because I believe in the eternality of each and every one of us. And I value and we love each and every one of us when we're alive. We can't forget about our preciousness even after we die. Have a good night. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.